Welcome back, everyone, to this second lecture on Plato's dialogues as they relate to our studies in education. This particular talk will inspect Socrates' trial speech before the Athenian assembly, popularly known as Plato's Apology. By the way, the word apology here doesn't mean what we mostly think of when we think of apologies, saying, "I'm sorry," and that sort of thing. No. In fact, as you read the speech, you'll see that Socrates really has nothing to be sorry for, so that, in this respect, his speech isn't an apology at all. The word apology actually comes from the Greek apologia, which means a defense. The word still retains its old meaning, if any of you have ever studied Christian apologetics, for example, which is the age-old practice of defending the Christian faith from its naysayers. In this speech, Socrates is defending himself from a capital charge brought against him for philosophizing in public. Sounds strange to us, but I think when you read it and think about it in association with other things we've already learned and thought about during our study of Plato's Meno, you'll come to see that it really isn't all that strange after all. Now, before we get down to the nitty-gritty, as Nacho Libre might say, I'd like to point out that Socrates' speech before the assembly is a very well-crafted piece of rhetoric. That is, if you look at his speech over against other famous courtroom speeches of the day, speeches held up to be models of organization, of the effective use of rhetorical devices, of proper form, and the rest of it, you'll see that Socrates' speech is spot on. So what I'm saying here is when you read Socrates' speech, don't take it in as though it were being spoken by some yokel, unable to speak before a crowd and all gersh in his approach. Socrates knows the forms of speech, right? He uses them well. If you put his speech beside, say, the defense of Palamedes, written by the sophist Gorgias, you'll see how parallel the two speeches run. The philosopher and the sophist, as we've already discussed in our chat about the Meno, certainly do look and sound an awful lot alike, but they're very opposite figures. And what separates them, as we've seen, is the spirit that underlies their speeches. We will see that divide again here in Plato's Apology. This being the case, we also need to be wary when we hear Socrates saying in the opening passages, "I am simply foreign to the manner of speech in a courtroom." We shouldn't just jump to the conclusion that he's some kind of big fat liar. Socrates isn't lying here. It isn't that he doesn't know how lawyers speak, or how men in courtrooms dispute with one another. Sure he does. Rather, what is foreign to him about courtroom rhetoric, and what his own masterful courtroom rhetoric will not embody, is the main function of rhetoric in the hands of a deft lawyer. Namely, if you're on the prosecuting side, you argue whatever you have to in order to win a guilty verdict. Or conversely, if you're making use of forensic practices for your own defense, you do so to win an acquittal. But Socrates' courtroom speech, his rhetoric, well, it's never really about that at all. In fact, if you look at it carefully, you might be inclined to say that winning at all costs is the furthest thing from his mind. He's simply not hip to that hand jive, or that so-called artistry of rhetorical speech. Rather, Socrates aims solely at telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, all consequences be damned. Now, since you've already been introduced to Socrates and you know something of him already from our previous readings and lectures, I'm going to forego restating those introductory comments about him here. Similarly, you've already met one of Socrates' main accusers, Anytus, in the Meno. Remember how he comes into the Lyceum while Meno and Socrates are talking? Remember how Socrates engages him in discussion? How Anytus grows increasingly angry and offended, and how he storms out after having voiced a threat to Socrates that he'd better watch himself? Well, we said last time that the dramatic date for the Meno was 402 BC. Socrates' trial and execution occurred in 399 BC, so basically 3 years later. Anytus is one of Socrates' accusers at his trial, and the other two men are named Meletus and Lycon. Of these three new accusers, Anytus seems to have been the most influential. He launches his complaint on behalf of the craftsmen and the politicians, Meletus on behalf of the poets, and Lycon on behalf of the orators. And whereas Anytus was a well-established, if not infamous, democratic politician at the time of the trial, Meletus was pretty much of a nobody. He was young. His dad was in all probability a poet, but Meletus himself very likely was not. Meletus's obscurity and his lack of influence are well noted by Socrates during his trial speech. For he says that if Meletus hadn't teamed up with Anytus and Lycon, he would have very likely have had to pay a whopping fine for launching a nuisance lawsuit that couldn't have garnered even a fifth of the votes. So much for Anytus and Meletus. But what about Lycon? Unlike Meletus, who was young at the time of the trial, Lycon, the third accuser, was from Socrates' own generation. The comic poet Aristophanes, one of Socrates' old and more potent accusers, portrays him elsewhere in his younger days as a drunken and disorderly man living beyond his means and having a promiscuous wife. Later in life, Lycon, similar to Anytus in this regard, is known to have become a democratic politician. There's mention in ancient comedy of his being accused of treachery and of betraying Naupactus to the Lacedaemonians, those are the Spartans, in 405. However, others like Xenophon portray Lycon in a positive light, as an excellent father. We also know that Lycon's son was put to death by edict of the 30 tyrants. Moreover, we know that some of Socrates' own close associates, men like Critias and Charmides, were numbered among these 30. If Socrates' own so-called students or interlocutors were among these oligarchs, then what responsibility does he bear for the death of Lycon's son under their blades? Some suppose that perhaps Lycon was suspicious of Socrates as somehow being affiliated with the 30, and that these suspicions may account for his animosity towards Socrates. Innuendo about Socrates' association with oligarchs might very well stand as part of the underlying reason as to why Lycon would bring such a serious suit against him. But there isn't a lot of agreement on this among scholars as a motivator for Lycon. Suffice it to say, Lycon's involvement in the suit is dealt with differently, even by Socrates himself. For whereas Socrates brings up the charges made by both Anytus and Meletus explicitly, even making an extensive cross-examination of Meletus before the assembly, he's silent towards Lycon. Perhaps Socrates' silence towards Lycon is in some way out of respect for the pain the father must have felt for his son. However, it's also worth noting as we read that Socrates doesn't remain silent about any suspicions that Lycon or others might have in regard to his supposed affiliations or complicity with the 30 tyrants. Quite clearly, Socrates tells everyone during his defense how he most certainly did not fall lockstep into the unjust orders that he was given under their regime. Now that we've investigated the major figures of the speech, let's begin our analysis of Plato's Apology, paying particular attention to what it can teach us about teaching. Socrates begins his speech by addressing his audience as men of Athens. You'll note that throughout his speech, Socrates maintains this mode of address, referring to those present as men, or andres. Our translators point out that Socrates' manner of address is itself a well-crafted choice and a significant departure from the ordinary way of addressing a jury. Normally, the word men, or andres, would not appear in such a speech, but instead the word for judges, or dikastai. Here, Socrates shows his familiarity with courtroom manners of speaking, but he also makes known his unwillingness to engage in any sort of flattery or disingenuous speech that would compromise the integrity of the truth that he is presenting for his countrymen's consideration. The implication in Socrates' choice of words here is that these men of Athens are not really fit judges. There is in this regard a kind of rudeness in Socrates' delivery. Socrates does not seek to ingratiate himself to his audience, even on pain of death. He stands before them to tell them the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And of course, Socrates knows how the truth he tells will not be inviolably persuasive. He knows how easily men, or andres, are misled by falsehoods, by rumors, and by long-standing innuendo. Indeed, near the end of his speech, we hear Socrates making mention of how these men of Athens who have voted against him and for his death are not real judges in truth, but only claim to be so. Only at the very end of his speech does Socrates ever speak to his countrymen as judges, O andres dikastai. And there, not because they're good judges of his character or of his choices, but only because his daimon makes no objection at all in the end about how he has pled his case, about how his pleading of it has led to a guilty verdict and his own eventual execution. How to understand the meaning of Socrates' daimon will be investigated later in the lecture. Now, your own classroom and your own school are much like a noisy courtroom full of self-professed judges. You too will find them to be places full of gossip and rumor, and not just your classroom, but the staff room at your school, and very often the bleachers at the hockey games outside of school hours, where parents gather to talk about you and your pedagogical choices. People talk, and not all their talk is reasonable or grounded in considerations of the truth. People lie. People indulge in their pretenses to knowing. People use words as weapons. How will you stand firm before your own accusers when they come for you? Will you be able to stand firm like Socrates in the justice of what you've done? Is teaching a way of life to you? Or is it merely your profession? How bending will you be in light of the pressures that are exerted upon you to bend? What consequences are you willing to accept? These are important questions to ask yourself as you embark on your life as a teacher. For teaching is not simply a job, ladies and gentlemen. If we are in any way like Socrates as people who inquire deeply and passionately into the truth, and who seek to lead others in such inquiries, then teaching must be a way of life for us. Teaching is therefore quite different from very many other professions and jobs that you may have tried or considered in the past. Keep your affinities with Socrates in mind as you continue to read. From the beginning of his speech, Socrates takes care to distinguish the three men who have brought him to court, his new accusers, from the really dangerous old accusers who, if anyone is able, will be the ones to sign his death warrant. It is with the substance of these old accusations that Socrates proposes to deal first, and only afterwards to move on to deal with the new complaints of Anytus, Meletus, and Lycon. These old accusers are mostly nameless and faceless, although the great comic poet Aristophanes is perhaps one of their finest exponents. But their accusations run deep as gossip and opinion often spoken, so often that it's become incontrovertible truth in the minds of the many. Indeed, many of these old accusations against Socrates still resonate with us today when we read about him, and when we hear what people continue to say of him, namely that he's a clever speaker. And the word in Greek for clever is deinos, which actually means dangerous. That he's a teacher, and that he most especially is ironic in his words. That means that he feigns ignorance of things when in fact he really isn't ignorant at all. That he's just being sneaky and clever and oh so tricksy. If ever you become a high school English teacher, and if you have to teach your students at some point about irony, one of the forms of irony that you will most certainly discuss with them is Socratic irony. Be warned! Indeed, Socrates points out that these old and nameless accusers, who have been forming people's opinions about him since they were children, are the most difficult accusers to counter. So don't be one, eh? Philosophy evaluations are on the tips of people's tongues generally, and they're hard to combat because, unlike with definite people who one might confront directly for interrogation, cheap men like Anytus and Meletus, rumor mill accusations seem to have no specific authorship at all. There's nobody one might question or refute face to face. Sure, Socrates cites Aristophanes' play, The Clouds, as a definitive source for such unfair portrayals of him as a sophist, as a thinker on the things above and below, and as one who makes the weaker argument into the stronger one. But ancient comedy is, after all, designed to undermine, to attack, and to criticize everybody and everything with impunity. Socrates was certainly not Aristophanes' sole target. Comedy leaves no sacred cow unslaughtered, and we expect comedy, especially of the Aristophanic variety, to be perverse in some fashion. However, the wide acceptance of these comedic images and general falsehoods that have taken root in the minds and hearts of the many is a different and more difficult problem altogether than what transpired in comedy written by Aristophanes and performed on stage 24 years prior to Socrates' trial. At the start of his defense against his old accusers, Socrates states his main concerns, which seem not really to have much to do with winning his case, and therefore, as I mentioned earlier, really have little to do with the ordinary functioning of forensic courtroom rhetoric. No, Socrates' primary concerns are first to speak piously, and second, to obey the law by making a defense speech, since such a speech is required in the circumstance where one finds oneself dragged to court. Socrates, therefore, repeats the slander accusations leveled against him by Meletus, that he does injustice and is meddlesome by investigating the things under the earth and the heavenly things, that he makes the weaker argument the stronger, and that he teaches these things to others. Socrates points out how these accusations are, in fact, not new, but quite old, and dramatized all too well by Aristophanes in his comedy. By repeating the accusations at this point in his defense speech, Socrates is drawing his audience's attention to two main complaints made against him. On the one hand, that he's somehow associated with those natural philosophers who were busy investigating how the stars and planets and the earth operate, the ancient equivalent of modern-day physicists, in such a way as to render questionable certain beliefs at the time in the divinity of the stars, the planets, and so forth. And on the other hand, that Socrates was a sophist, that he used heuristical methods of speaking to undermine traditions and to subvert reason, and that, as a sophist, he operated in such a way as to make a livelihood off of teaching these so-called clever modes of speaking to the youth, thus leading to their own corruption and immorality. The charge against Socrates, in a nutshell, is what is known as a writ of impiety, what the Greeks called a graphe asebias. And it was an extraordinary crime, too. It's important to note at this point that Athens wasn't a place where there were too many limits on freedom of speech. In fact, free speech, or the ability to tell the truth no matter what the truth was, something they called parasia, was held up by the Athenians generally as a great and noble good, something that distinguished Hellenic peoples from their barbarian counterparts, in fact. So please understand that ancient Athens wasn't medieval Europe under the church, where heretics would be burned at the stake with regularity, or where scientists like Galileo later in the 16th and 17th centuries would be muzzled or placed under house arrest. No, in ancient Athens, you could pretty much say whatever you wanted about the gods, or about your neighbor, or about anything, really. The closest parallel to what happened to Socrates here is what happened to Anaxagoras some years earlier, when he was pursued on a similar charge for teaching that the planets and stars aren't gods, but rather stones and fire. Mind you, even he wasn't being pursued for heresy. Rather, he was a teacher to Pericles, one of the great and famous statesmen of ancient Athens. Pericles, he had many enemies, and the writ against Anaxagoras, this writ of impiety, was more than anything a roundabout way for them just to attack the politician. Well, there were, of course, laws and law courts in which you could be held accountable for slander. But during the special times allotted for their great tragic and comic festivals, which were generously scattered throughout the entire year, the Greeks could get away with saying just about anything about anyone, no matter what it was. All such acts of parasia were sanctioned as part of one's pious participation in the Dionysian festivals. Deity is giver. This isn't to say that there were no ways to offend or to cause an offense, or that everything was considered pious and hunky-dory. Clearly that wasn't the case, just ask Socrates, eh? Indeed, a charge of impiety was a very serious matter in Athens. It was worse than murder, really, because whereas murder might only affect a single person, the guy getting killed, or a single person's family or household, impiety was a kind of pollution that was thought to bleed out in such a way as to affect the whole city's welfare and safety. Still, a charge of impiety was normally restricted to something like profaning the mysteries, or mutilating sacred objects like the Herms, or some blasphemy or sacrilege to do with the city's religion. Socrates didn't do any of that stuff, did he? Apart from pretty specific dumb and stupid things you might do, it was hard to come under the gun of a charge of impiety. People in Athens weren't held to account for having unorthodox opinions, or for speaking against a creed or a dogma. Really, such things as creeds and dogmas or doctrines didn't exist back then. Religion per se didn't exist in ancient Athens, or at least the way that we think about what is religion. Sure, there were various cults to various gods and goddesses, and you could go and observe rituals or make prayers to whatever god you pleased, but impiety wasn't ever something that had to do with something somebody might say. It was more or less about something somebody did. So if it wasn't so much what Socrates said, then what did he do that drove people nuts? Well, Socrates goes on to tell us next. He says that, while not being a sophist or a wise man, and certainly not being a man who would therefore deign to sell his wisdom to others or to teach them any sort of wisdom he does not himself possess, he has acquired a name among others for a certain kind of wisdom, which he says that he probably does in fact have. However, this wisdom of which he speaks isn't any great thing. Socrates calls it a human wisdom, or anthropina sophia. He says the folks who speak against him and who are most angry with him feel that they have a much greater wisdom than this anthropina sophia. Furthermore, some of them suggest that Socrates himself is being disingenuous about his wisdom, that he is indeed wise in the sense of clever, but also ironic in his speech, whereby he attempts to hide or dissemble from this fact. Socrates, however, denies having any such wisdom. Okay, so what is this anthropina sophia, this human wisdom that Socrates agrees he possesses? At this point, he tells us the story of how Chaerephon, a well-known Athenian citizen and a companion to Socrates, once visited the oracle at Delphi. For those of you who've never heard of the oracle or Delphi before, in ancient times the city of Delphi was considered the belly button or omphalos of the world. It was Middle Earth, the very center of the cosmic universe. As such, it was a place of significant spiritual importance, right? It was the place where the realms of the heavens and the earth and the underworld all had intimate connection. It was the place where the oracle resided. Now, the oracle was a kind of ancient institution of prophecy and spiritual power, a place dedicated to Apollo, but also associated with Dionysus. Perhaps you've heard how, when travelers in ancient times approached Delphi, as they passed through the gates of its main temple, they'd walk below the famous inscription over its entrance, bidding each one of them to know thyself, or gnophi auton. This divine command to know thyself is really also at the heart of Socrates' philosophic inquiries. At any rate, the priestesses of Apollo sat in the temple of Delphi, and having fallen into a trance, they'd be overtaken by certain ecstasies in which they might offer a riddled response to sojourners from far and wide who were desperate to know the answers to their pressing questions about the ambitions they harbored, perhaps the outcomes of war, political moves, and so forth. These oracular responses are famously vague and cryptic. Often, visitors were emissaries sent by kings and conquerors, and having been relayed the message, kings would be inflamed with desires, their pride or hubris, and most especially their pretense to knowing what the oracle really meant, would get the better of them, which in turn would lead to their downfall. One of the most famous of these was the case of Croesus, the rich king of Lydia, who wished to pick a fight with the Persians. Having sent his own emissaries and gifts upon gifts upon gifts to the Delphic oracle, he had them ask, "If I go to war with the Persians, will I be successful?" To which the oracle replied, "If you enter into this war, a great kingdom will fall." Well, naturally enough, Croesus supposed that this meant that the great king himself, namely the Persian king, would get a whooping. But alas, Croesus himself was the one to be defeated in battle. So it goes. Chaerephon didn't visit Delphi for any such political ambitious reason. However, he only went there to ask about his good friend Socrates. He wanted to know if there was anyone wiser than him. The oracle replied that no one was wiser. Chaerephon brought this news back to Socrates, and when he told Socrates, it amazed him and filled him with perplexity. What the heck was the oracle talking about? I'm not wise. I don't know anything about what makes a man happy, or what is justice, or what is virtue. What's the meaning of this riddle? These were something like Socrates' thoughts, I imagine. And yet, Socrates also knew that the god does not lie. so he couldn't just brush the comment off either. Notice how Socrates responds so differently from Croesus in the other story. Where Croesus is filled with pride, where he swells or puffs up with the pretense to knowing, Socrates designs a test, he designs to test the meaning of the oracle. He doesn't allow his pride to delude him. He harbors no pretense to knowing, but rather sets out to refute the oracle. And this process of refuting the oracle in order to see what it might mean, he views as his assigned calling in life, really. He's been told a perplexing truth, and he seeks to know what it means. He seeks to know the meaning of this thing that the oracle has said to him, or said about him, rather. Aligned with the oracle's command, he seeks to know himself. And this becomes the mandate of his entire life journey. It is the activity of questioning, however, that ends up driving people nuts around him. So, Socrates goes around Athens looking for someone who might in fact be wiser than him. He went to the politicians, to the artists, to the artisans and craftsmen. Really, he spoke with anyone and everyone willing to chat. Sometimes he'd find that people actually did know things, and were wise to that extent. Like the craftsmen, for instance. They knew their stuff when it came to their trade. But no matter where he went or with whom he spoke, he also found that there was much pretense to knowing more than what was actually known. The carpenter, for instance, would know the art of building very well, but he'd also suppose that that gave him some kind of authority to speak about what is justice or what is truth. What irritated people was having their pride bubbles burst in these things. Many of them didn't like finding out that what they thought they knew, they didn't really know. And not only that, you've heard how Athens and the Greeks were renowned for their love of disputation and conversations, right? How they loved a good debate, just like they loved a fine wrestling match. Well, folks and young people in particular would gather around during such conversations with Socrates. And so, when Socrates would dialogue with somebody, say a politician, an artist, a craftsman, or maybe just somebody's parent, and when that discussion would eventually reveal that person's pretense to knowing, well, in many ways, this made the revelation of their ignorance feel like a kind of public shaming to some of Socrates' dialogue partners. Not only that, the young people listening, close by in attendance, really liked the competitive possibilities of conversational disputation. They saw here, in Socrates' dialectic, a kind of technique that they could use to teach their own fathers to suck eggs. In the Republic, another of Plato's great dialogues, Socrates likens the joy that youths take in learning how to speak in the question and answer format to the delight that puppies take when they get hold of something and tear it to shreds. In other words, there's a kind of playfulness and power that's attractive to youth in Socratic discussions, just as there is great danger for Socrates' puffed-up interlocutors of having their own pride bubbles burst in a very public way. Think back to Anytus's rage in the Meno, when he's led through discussion to the realization that parents and statesmen in Athens have no idea how to educate their own children in the virtues that might enable them to be happy and good human beings. Now, imagine that response among the parents in your future classroom. Fun, isn't it? Also, at this point in our readings, you might ask yourself, what responsibilities do I bear for the manner in which my students take up their inquiries into what is true? What responsibility do I bear for the rage, embarrassment, anxiety, and negativity that arises when my students encounter their own ignorance. Is it well and meet that students encounter perplexity, confusion, or aporia as a part of their schooling? One interesting fact about aporia, that's another word for confusion or perplexity. One interesting fact about aporia and the anxiety we nowadays typically associate with it. The philosopher Eric Voegelin has investigated this matter carefully and textually. He's found out that the words for anxiety don't really start to appear in ancient texts until Cicero's day. In other words, among the ancient Greek peoples, the most common response to discovering that one didn't know what one thought one knew wasn't anger or hostility or anxiety, but rather wonder. Wonder. The Greek word is thauma. Wonder is called the starting point and source for all philosophizing, but it's also the starting point for any learning, in fact, because you can't ever learn anything new if you already think you know everything, right? So really, you have to get into that frame of mind where you are aware of your own ignorance and not at all threatened by it, but rather, in the spirit of wonder, you're actually thankful to have your ass handed to you. May I have another, sir? Philosophy, with its roots in wonder, also begins not with anxiety, but rather with deep appreciation, with gratitude, and a thankfulness to be shown one's ignorance. The question I therefore pose to you as future teachers is, how can you create a climate within your own classroom, not of anxious and angry lycons, anatises, and melodises, that's a lot of yeses, but rather of wide-open wanderers, of folks happy to be there, full of gratitude for the space you've carved out in the school in which they might seek to know, what is, to contemplate and to wonder. Now back to the apology. Through all of his inquiries and investigations, Socrates came to understand what the oracle meant by saying that nobody was wiser than him. Namely, he came to see that, although neither he nor his interlocutors really knew anything of great substance, Socrates, at least, didn't profess to know such things. He didn't hold any pretense to know things that he didn't know. Whereas all the others with whom he spoke did harbor such presumptions. So this little edge on all the others, if you will, is really the substance of Socrates' little wisdom, his little human wisdom, or his anthroponosophia. Moreover, to all those who suggest that Socrates ironically dissembles that he's wise and really does know when he refutes someone else's pretense to knowing, Socrates cites Pythagoras' statement that only the god is wise, and therefore that the human wisdom Socrates himself displays is worth little or nothing by comparison. Indeed, if anything might be suggested by the oracle's response, it is that Socrates, because of his awareness of his own ignorance, ought to serve as a pattern. The Greek word here is paradigma, where we get our word paradigm from. He ought to serve as a paradigm for the rest of us, having himself become cognizant that, in truth, he is worth little or nothing with respect to wisdom. One thing that comes out very clearly in his speech against the old accusers is how piety is actually the driving force behind Socrates' investigations. How everything he did was in fact done out of obedience to the god, and in order to understand better what the god at Delphi meant by his riddle. This is not to say that Socrates ever professes to know the meaning of piety. Indeed, if you're interested, you might read Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, in order to see how Socrates' discussion about piety ends in perplexity or aporia. However, although Socrates may not know what is piety, he nonetheless follows what he considers to be a pious path by seeking self-knowledge. How ridiculous, then, is this writ of impiety leveled against him, eh? And how much more surprising is such a writ in a city like Athens, considering that impiety, as we've already seen, is a charge leveled not against what one might say, but rather against something one might do. And Socrates has done nothing but inquire into the meaning of the divination passed to him by Chaerephon, after all.